The wind tasted of rust and distance. It swept across the high plains, a ceaseless breath that scoured the land down to its bones of rock and red earth. It carried the scent of crushed sage, the musk of a herd of pronghorn flowing like a tawny river over a distant rise, and something new, the sharp, metallic tang of the railroad, a wound of iron bleeding rust into the soil, for Maeve O'Rourke, leaning against the rocking frame of the stagecoach. It was the smell of a last chance. Ash Hollow was not so much a town as a raw nerve ending on the edge of the territory. It clung to a shallow dip in the plains, a jumble of raw lumber buildings that looked as if they had been thrown there by a careless hand. A single, wide street, more dust than road, served as its spine. At one end, the new telegraph pole stood like a lone, leafless tree, its single wire humming a song of faraway power. At the other, the Quinn's boarding house and saloon stood, its 2 stories making it a giant among the shacks. It was there Maeve was headed. A letter of introduction from a priest in a town 200 miles east, clutched in her worn satchel. The coach groaned to a stop, and the dust it had kicked up swirled in a final, choking cloud before settling. Maeve gathered her skirts, her movements careful and deliberate, and stepped down onto the hard-packed earth. She felt the eyes on her immediately. Men, their faces grimed with the effort of laying track or digging for color in the hills, paused to watch the new arrival. She kept her gaze fixed on the worn sign of the boarding house, her shoulders set in a defensive line she had perfected over 25 years. Freedom, she had told herself, was simply a place where one could work and be left alone. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of stale beer, boiled cabbage, and unwashed bodies. A few men sat at a table, their voices a low rumble, a woman with a tired face and flour on her apron. Nora Quinn looked up from behind the bar. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice flat but not unkind. Maeve presented the letter. "I was told you might have need of a seamstress, or someone to help with the books. My hand is clear and I'm quick with sums." Nora Quinn scanned the letter, her lips moving slightly as she read. Before she could answer, one of the men at the table laughed, a short, ugly bark. "Look what the stage dragged in. Boys," he said, not bothering to lower his voice. He had a coarse red beard and small eyes. "Came all this way to find a husband. I reckon she'll have a long wait." His companion snickered. "She's got a face that could scare a coyote off a gut wagon." The words struck Maeve like stones. They were not new, but each one found the same bruised place inside her. She felt the familiar heat rise in her cheeks, a flush of shame she could not control. She stiffened, her chin lifting a fraction of an inch, her gaze remaining fixed on Nora Quinn. She would not give them the satisfaction of seeing her flinch. She had learned long ago that her plain face, her nose a bit too strong, her mouth a little too wide, was a ledger upon which the world wrote its casual cruelties. Her defense was a wall of quiet endurance. Nora Quinn's eyes narrowed, a flicker of something, perhaps sympathy, perhaps just irritation at the disruption. "Hush your noise, you two. You've got no call to speak, so—" She looked back at Maeve. "We can use another hand. The mending piles up faster than I can manage. And Tom's books are a mess. The room upstairs is small, but it's clean. You'll take your meals with us. You can start tomorrow." It was more than Maeve had hoped for. A room, work, a small measure of shelter from the wind and the world. "Thank you, ma'am," she said, her voice quiet but steady. The words of the men still hung in the air, clinging to her like the red dust. She followed Nora up the creaking stairs, acutely aware of her own form, feeling clumsy and exposed. Freedom, she thought with a twist of bitterness, was still a long way off. Later that afternoon, the simmering tension of the town boiled over. A man on a lathered horse galloped down the main street. Shouting, "Wagon train, the supply wagon from Fort Laramie hit about 5 miles out." The saloon emptied in a rush. Men poured into the street, their faces a mixture of alarm and a kind of grim excitement. Maeve watched from the second-story window of her new room, a small square that looked out over the main thoroughfare. The rider, a freight man named Peters, was surrounded. It was them Lakota, he gasped, clutching a bloody arm. Came out of the rocks, whooping and hollering. Arrows flying everywhere. They took everything. Flour, bacon, whiskey. All of it. A dark murmur ran through the crowd. The name Lakota was spoken like a curse. It was a familiar story, a convenient explanation for every misfortune that befell the town. Lost cattle, a dry well, a sudden storm. It was all laid at the feet of the people who had lived on this land for generations. Sheriff Clay Harlan pushed his way through the crowd. He was a big man with a florid face and an air of importance that seemed too large for his dusty star. "Now, calm down, everyone," he boomed, though he did nothing to lower his own voice. "I'll form a posse. We'll ride out at first light and teach those savages a lesson." A cheer went up. The men were eager for a fight, for a simple target for their fears and frustrations. Maeve watched them, a cold knot forming in her stomach. It was too easy, too quick. The freight man's story felt rehearsed. As dusk settled, painting the sky in bruised shades of purple and orange, Maeve found she could not stay in her small room. The air was too close, her thoughts too loud. She went downstairs and slipped out the back door of the boarding house, seeking the cool evening air. She walked past the woodpile and the rain barrel, toward the relative quiet behind the stables. It was there she heard the voices, low and conspiratorial, drifting from the narrow space between the stable and the blacksmith's forge. She froze, pressing herself into the shadows of the building. "The story is holding," a smooth, cultured voice said. It was a voice that did not belong to a prospector or a railroad hand. She recognized it as belonging to Elias Pike, the man who was financing the new rail spur, a man who moved with the predatory grace of a wolf in fine clothing. Peters earned his bonus. Another voice, rougher, replied. He almost believed it himself by the time he rode in. "Belief is not required. Performance is," Pike said coolly. "Sheriff Harlan will make a good show of it tomorrow. He will find the tracks we left for him, and the broken arrows. When the railroad agent arrives, he will find a town under siege, a clear case of depredation. The insurance will cover our losses tenfold, and the territorial governor will have no choice but to authorize the removal of the Lakota from the valley. Their land is far more valuable with track running through it." Maeve's blood ran cold. It was a lie. All of it. A calculated, venomous lie designed to steal and dispossess. She had stumbled upon the rot at the heart of Ash Hollow. She felt a tremor of fear, sharp and sickening. Pike was not just a bully in a saloon. He was a man who moved sheriffs and governors like pieces on a board. She backed away slowly, her heart hammering against her ribs. A loose stone shifted under her foot, a small sound, but in the stillness of the evening, it sounded as loud as a gunshot. The voices stopped. Maeve did not wait. She turned and fled, her skirts catching on the rough wood of the stable wall. She did not look back, but she felt their eyes on her, felt the sudden, chilling weight of their attention. She scrambled through the back door of the boarding house, her breath coming in ragged gasps, and hurried up to the safety of her room. She sat on her narrow bed in the darkness. The door bolted and tried to calm the frantic beating of her heart. What could she do? Go to the sheriff Harlan was Pike's man? Tell Nora or Tom Quinn? They were good people, but they were afraid, trying to survive like everyone else. She was alone, a stranger with a plain face nobody would trust, holding a truth so dangerous it could get her killed. The fear did not subside. As the night deepened, it sharpened into a certainty. Pike would not leave a witness. He could not afford to. The silence of the town outside her window was no longer peaceful. It was menacing. Every creak of the floorboards in the hallway, every gust of wind against the glass, was a threat. She knew she could not stay in the room. A perfect trap. She had to move, to find a place to hide until she could think. Unlatching her door, she crept down the stairs, which groaned under her weight. each sound an agony of suspense. The main room was empty, lit by a single guttering lamp. She slipped out the front door into the cold, empty street. The moon was a sliver, offering little light. Shadows lay thick and deep between the buildings. She started toward the livery, thinking she might hide in the hayloft. But then she heard it, the soft crunch of boots on the dusty street behind her. Not one set, but two. Panic seized her. She began to walk faster, her stride clumsy with fear. They matched her pace. She broke into a run, her only thought to reach the edge of town, to lose them in the rocks and scrubland that began where the last shack ended. The air burned in her lungs. She could hear them closing the distance, their steps confident and unhurried. They were toying with her. She risked a glance over her shoulder and saw their silhouettes, two large men moving with grim purpose. She reached the end of the street and scrambled into the darkness of the open country. Thorny bushes tore at her dress and scratched her skin. She stumbled on the uneven ground, falling hard. A sharp pain shot through her arm as it scraped against a rock. They were on her then. A hand grabbed her shoulder, spinning her around. In the faint moonlight, she saw a cruel face, a glint of metal. And then, a shadow detached itself from the deeper shadow of a rock outcropping. It moved with a silence and speed that was unnatural. There was no sound, only a sudden, fluid motion. One of the men grunted and fell. The other turned, startled, and a long, dark shape arced through the air, catching him on the side of the head. He crumpled without a sound. Maeve stared, breathless, at the figure who stood over the fallen men. He was tall and lean, dressed in buckskin. His face was all sharp angles and quiet intensity, framed by two long black braids. He was Lakota. He turned his gaze to her, and his dark eyes held no expression she could read. He took a step closer, and she flinched away, her heart still racing. He stopped, holding up a hand, a gesture not of threat, but of peace. He knelt beside her and gently took her arm, his touch surprisingly warm. He examined the long, bloody scrape. "It is not deep," he said, his voice a low, calm rumble that seemed to absorb the frantic energy of the night. He took a strip of clean linen from a pouch at his belt and expertly wrapped the wound, his movements efficient and sure. When he was done, he looked directly into her eyes. The intensity of his gaze made her feel as though he could see the entire terrifying story of her night there. "They know you heard," he said, his words confirming her worst fear. "The man in the white hat does not leave loose ends." He meant Pike. He stood, a silhouette against the stars. "Do not go to the sheriff. He is a part of it. Stay in the light. Do not be alone until you cannot." And then, as silently as he had appeared, he was gone, melting back into the rocks and the darkness. Maeve was alone with two unconscious men, the cold night air on her face, and a stranger's quiet warning echoing in her mind. The wind picked up, swirling the red dust around her feet, and for the first time, she felt its chill not just on her skin, but deep in her soul. Maeve scrambled back to the boarding house, a ghost in the moonlight, her breath a ragged tear in the fabric of the night. She did not stop until the bolt of her small room was thrown, the sound unnaturally loud in the silent building. She stood with her back pressed against the wood, listening, her body trembling not from the cold but from a fear so profound it felt like a sickness. Sleep was impossible. Every shadow that danced on the wall was a man with a cruel face. Every creak of the old house a footstep on the stair. The Lakota man's words echoed in her mind, a quiet counterpoint to her frantic pulse. "Stay in the light. Do not be alone until you cannot." When morning came, it brought no relief, only a harsh, clarifying light that made the danger seem more real. The sounds of the town waking up, the clatter of pans from the kitchen below, the distant clang of the blacksmith's hammer, all felt fragile, a thin veneer over the violence that lurked beneath. She had to be sure about Sheriff Harlan. A desperate, foolish part of her still hoped the Lakota man was wrong. that the law was not entirely for sale in Ash Hollow. She tidied her appearance as best she could, her fingers clumsy as she tried to pin her hair. She went downstairs, avoiding Nora Quinn's questioning gaze, and stepped out into the street. The red dust was already stirring in the morning breeze. She walked with a purpose she did not feel toward the sheriff's office, a squat building with a single barred window. She would not go in and accuse him. She would simply observe. Her pretext was simple. She would ask about filing a complaint about the ruffians from the saloon the day before. As she approached, her resolve faltered. Standing before the office was Elias Pike, his expensive suit immaculate against the town's grime. He was speaking to Sheriff Harlan, his voice a low, confident murmur. Harlan was nodding, his expression one of fawning agreement. Pike handed the sheriff a silver cigar case. Harlan opened it, selected a cigar with a show of careful consideration, and tucked the case into his own coat pocket as if it were a gift long expected. The gesture was small, casual, and utterly damning. It was a transaction, a sealing of a bargain made in shadows. There was no help for her there. The law had a master, and it was not justice. Maeve turned away before they could see her, her heart a leaden weight in her chest. She walked back to the boarding house, the knowledge of her complete isolation settling upon her. She was a witness, and in a town like Ash Hollow, a witness was a liability to be removed. Back in the kitchen, Nora Quinn clucked over the scrape on her arm, which Maeve had rewrapped with a cleaner cloth. Nora was a decent woman, caught in the currents of this place, trying to keep her family afloat. Maeve could not bring herself to burden her with this dangerous truth. She murmured something about tripping in the dark. Finn, the Quinn's 17-year-old son, was sweeping the floor nearby. He was a lanky boy, all sharp angles and nervous energy, caught in that uncertain space between boy and man. As Nora tended to another task, Maeve leaned against the wall, the full weight of her situation pressing down on her. She whispered the words to herself, a bitter confirmation. Harlan is Pike's man. The broom clattered to the floor. Maeve looked up to see Finn staring at her, his face pale, his eyes wide with a fear she recognized because it mirrored her own. He knew something. He had seen or heard something that made her words strike him like a physical blow. Without a word, he snatched up his broom and fled out the back door, a frightened deer startled by the scent of a predator. He was no ally. He was just another person trapped by fear. The day crawled by, each hour stretching into an eternity of suspense. Maeve did her work, her hands stitching and mending with an automatic precision while her mind raced. She felt hunted. The glances of the men in the saloon, the way a railroad worker watched her for a moment too long. Everything felt like a threat. The warning to stay in the light was a torment. It meant being seen, being watched. Night fell again, heavy and starless. A storm was brewing on the horizon, the air thick with an unspoken promise of violence. Maeve retreated to her room, but it no longer felt like a sanctuary. It was a cage. She pushed her small chest of drawers against the door, a futile gesture that did little to calm her. She sat on the bed, fully clothed, listening. A soft scraping sound came from the window. Maeve leaped to her feet, her heart seizing. It was not the sound of a man trying to force his way in. It was small, insistent, a pebble striking the glass. She crept to the window, peering through a crack in the curtains. Below, a figure stood in the deep shadow of the alley. It was him, Chaska. She carefully unlatched the window and slid it open a few inches. The night air was cool on her face. He spoke without looking up, his voice barely a whisper. Yet it carried clearly. Pike's men are watching the front and the back. They are waiting for the town to sleep. The choice was not a choice at all. It was a statement of fact. To stay was to be cornered. "You must leave this place," he said. "I can guide you through the canyons. By morning, you will be far away." The thought of going into the wilderness with this man, a stranger, was terrifying. But the thought of staying, of waiting for the sound of her door splintering, was worse. He had saved her once. He had no reason to help her, yet he was here, in a land where the law was a lie. Perhaps trust had to be placed in something else. She gave a single short nod. He pointed to a spot below, a low shed roof. Be ready. Maeve gathered nothing but her small satchel with the priest's letter and the few coins she possessed. She pushed the chest away from the door, took a last look at the small room that had represented a fragile hope, and slipped out into the hallway. She crept down the stairs and out the back, moving through the shadows as he had. He was waiting for her behind the woodpile. He moved without a sound, a phantom in the darkness, and she followed as best she could. They skirted the edge of town, a place of trash heaps and scrawny dogs that barked half-heartedly at their passing. Soon, the last of the shacks fell away, and they were in the open. The vast, dark plain stretching out before them under a sky that was beginning to flash with distant lightning. The journey was a brutal education. The ground was not flat but a treacherous landscape of rocks and sharp-edged gullies. Chaska moved with an easy, tireless gait, seeming to read the land with his feet. Maeve struggled to keep up, her city-bred muscles protesting, her lungs burning. The silence between them was absolute, broken only by the sound of their footsteps and the rising wind. As the first hint of dawn threatened to expose them on the open plain, he led her into the mouth of a narrow canyon. The rock walls rose steeply on either side, red and sheer, offering shelter and hiding their passage. But here the air was still and hot, and the ground was a bed of loose stone that made each step a potential disaster. Her water was gone. Her throat was a dry, rasping knot of pain. They rested in the shade of an overhang, the sun now a merciless hammer in the sky above the canyon rim. Chaska offered her his water skin. She drank sparingly, ashamed of her weakness. She felt like a burden, a clumsy piece of luggage he was forced to drag through this unforgiving land. He seemed to sense her thoughts. "You are stronger than you believe," he said, his voice quiet. "This land asks much. You are answering." She looked away, toward the stark beauty of the canyon. The words of the men in the saloon echoed in her memory, the casual cruelty of it. She wondered what he saw when he looked at her. "I came from a place that was also hard," she found herself saying, her voice hoarse. "A green place, but one of starvation and sorrow. We came on a boat, crowded together like cattle. We were told America was a promised land. For some, I suppose it is. For others, it is just a different kind of hunger." He listened without interruption, his gaze steady. He did not offer empty platitudes or easy sympathy. When she finished, he was silent for a long moment. Then he said, "My people have a promise too, to the land, to our children, to the memory of our ancestors. A man can sell his horse, his furs, even his weapon if he must, but he cannot sell his word. He cannot sell his honor. It is all he truly owns." His words were simple, yet they landed with the weight of stone. He was not just running from Pike's men. He was standing for something. He was living by a code in a lawless country. They pushed on. The heat was relentless. Maeve saw tracks in the dust near a dry creek bed. Tracks she recognized from pictures in books. Wolf. The presence of the unseen predators added a new, primal edge to her fear. Late in the afternoon, the sky turned a strange, bruised green. The wind died suddenly, and an eerie silence fell over the canyon. Chaska stopped, his head tilted, listening. Then the first one hit, a piece of ice the size of a pigeon's egg, then another and another. Within moments, the air was filled with a deafening roar as a hailstorm of incredible violence descended upon them. The stones hammered at their backs and shoulders, hard enough to bruise. Chaska pulled her under a shallow ledge, shielding her body with his own as the ice crashed down around them. The storm passed as quickly as it came, leaving the canyon floor white and battered. But the danger was not over. A low rumble began, growing steadily into a roar that shook the very rock beneath their feet. A flash flood. The dry wash at the bottom of the canyon was now a churning, muddy torrent, a brown monster devouring everything in its path. And they were on the wrong side of it. The flood separated them from the only scalable path out of the canyon. They were trapped. Maeve stared at the raging water, a fresh wave of despair washing over her. Chaska did not waste time. He scanned the opposite bank, his eyes searching. He pointed to a thick, gnarled juniper tree, its roots clinging tenaciously to the rock face. He uncoiled a long, braided leather rope from his shoulder. He said, "The root will hold." He tied one end securely around his waist. He threw the other end across the torrent. It fell short. He recoiled it, his movements fluid and economical. The second time, the loop snagged on a thick branch of the juniper. He pulled it taut, testing it with his full weight. It held. He looked at Maeve. "You will cross first. Hold the rope. Do not look down. I will hold you from this side." She looked at the churning water, at the thin rope, and then at him. She was afraid she would slip, that her weight would pull them both into the deadly current. She was a burden, a weakness that would be his undoing. Her fear must have shown on her face. He spoke again, his voice calm and firm in the roar of the water. "I will not let you fall." She took a deep breath and grabbed the rope, the wet leather rough against her hands. She stepped into the water. The current was immensely powerful, sucking at her legs, trying to tear her from her feet. The icy water soaked her to the bone. She kept her eyes on the juniper root, her knuckles white as she pulled herself along, hand over hand. The roar of the water filled her ears. Halfway across, her foot slipped on a slick rock. She cried out as the current swept her legs out from under her, but the rope held. She felt the unyielding anchor of Chaska's grip from the bank, steadying her, giving her the strength to find her footing again. She reached the other side, collapsing onto the rocky bank, soaked, shivering, and exhausted. She turned to watch him. He untied his end and, with a powerful leap, launched himself across the gap, using the rope to swing to her side with a grace that stole her breath. He landed lightly beside her. The floodwaters raged on, but they were safe. The storm was over. They sat in silence for a long time, side by side, catching their breath as the adrenaline slowly subsided. He had not let her fall. In a world of lies and shifting loyalties, that one simple truth was a rock to cling to. The decision to return was not born of courage, but of a cold, hard certainty. To keep running was to be forever hunted. Elias Pike was not a man who would simply forget. He would pursue her, or if he could not find her, he would complete his vile plan, and the lie would become the region's truth, written in blood and displacement. Maeve knew, with an instinct that had been honed by a lifetime of survival, that the only way to be free of the hunter was to dismantle his trap, and the trap's machinery was back in Ash Hollow. She explained it to Chaska as they sat watching the sunrise paint the canyon walls in hues of rose and gold. Her voice was low, devoid of the tremors she felt inside. "He has proof of his own lies, invoices, shipping manifests. If I could find them, find something that shows the goods were never truly stolen, then my word would be more than just air." Chaska listened, his face impassive as the stone around them. He had cleaned the scrapes on his hands from the flood, his movements economical and precise. "You would be walking back into the fire," he said. It was not a question. "The fire is already spreading," she countered. "Soon it will burn everything. Your people, anyone who stands in his way. I cannot run far enough to escape that." He looked at her then, his gaze direct, searching. He saw not a frightened woman, but one who had weighed the cost and found it acceptable. He gave a slow, single nod. "We will go back, but not in darkness. We will go in the light. They will look for us in the shadows. We will hide in the open." It was a daring plan, one that relied on the very arrogance of their pursuers. They walked back not through the hidden canyons, but along the high ridges, moving in the full glare of the sun. From that vantage, Ash Hollow was a collection of insignificant boxes in a vast, empty landscape. It looked small and manageable, a trick of the light and distance. They entered the town from the east, where the new telegraph lines were being strung. They became two more figures in a busy scene of workers and wagons. Chaska carried a small bundle of cured rabbit skins, transforming himself from a fugitive into a trader. Maeve walked with her head down. Just another woman on an errand. She went straight to the boarding house. Nora Quinn was too busy with the breakfast rush to ask more than if she was feeling better. And Maeve was grateful for the chaos. Her chance came at mid-morning. Nora sent her to the mercantile for a sack of beans. Pike's large warehouse stood directly behind it, a long, windowless building of raw pine. Maeve's heart hammered against her ribs. She purchased the beans. Then, instead of returning directly, she slipped into the narrow, refuse-strewn alley that ran between the two buildings. The air was close and smelled of sour earth. Halfway down, a section of siding on the warehouse had warped in the sun, leaving a gap just wide enough for her to squeeze through. Inside, the air was thick with the smell of dust, burlap, and dry rot. Light filtered in through cracks in the roof, illuminating swirling motes of dust in the cavernous space. Crates and barrels were stacked high, creating a maze of narrow passages. At the far end, in a small, partitioned-off area that served as an office, she saw a desk and a high stool. That was her goal. She moved with a quiet born of terror, her ears straining for any sound of approach. The desk was a mess of papers held down by a rock. She shuffled through them with trembling fingers. Shipping manifests, lists of supplies, letters from the east. And then she found it, a separate ledger. Its cover unmarked. Inside, in Pike's elegant, forward-slanting script, were lists of goods. Beside each entry was a notation delivered. The dates were all from the week before the supposed raid. She compared the items to a manifest on the desk for the stolen wagon train. They were identical. It was the proof. Pike was billing the railroad and collecting insurance for goods that were already safely in his warehouse. A noise from outside made her freeze. A wagon rumbled by. When the sound faded, she took the ledger and tucked it into the waistband of her dress. The stiff leather cover, a hard, dangerous rectangle against her skin. Her search was not over. A ledger could be explained away, dismissed as a mistake. She needed something more. She began to explore the warehouse, moving deeper into the shadows. In a back corner, behind a stack of barrels, she found what was left of the raid. A few splintered crates, a broken wagon wheel, and a half-dozen arrows. Their shafts snapped, their flint heads crudely made. It was a stage set. And then she saw the paint. A small can of bright blue paint sat on a crate. A brush laid across its lid. A simple stencil. The letter P inside a circle lay beside it. She looked at the crates Pike had claimed were part of the stolen shipment, the ones he had already received. On the side of each, almost hidden near the bottom, was the same stenciled mark. The blue paint was identical. It was a secret inventory mark, a way for Pike to identify his own property. And the same mark was on the splintered crates from the fake raid. As she turned to leave, her hand brushed against a heavy canvas tarp. Curiosity made her lift a corner. Underneath stood a machine of iron and gears, silent and immense. A printing press. It was old, covered in a thick blanket of dust and neglect. A sleeping giant of truth in a den of lies. For a moment, she imagined its great arms moving, its gears turning, printing sheets of paper that would shout her discovery to the world. It was a foolish, desperate thought. She squeezed back through the gap in the wall, her mind racing. She had the ledger. She had seen the mark. It was enough. It had to be. She started back toward the main street, a new, fragile hope blooming in her chest. The hope shattered when she saw the commotion in front of the sheriff's office. Harlan and two thuggish deputies had Chaska cornered against the wall of the blacksmith's shop. A small crowd had gathered to watch. Chaska stood with his arms loose at his sides, his expression unreadable. his stillness a stark contrast to Harlan's red-faced blustering. "Trespassing on company land," Harlan shouted, "playing to the crowd. And what is this?" He snatched a pistol from his deputy's hand and held it up. "Found this tucked in his belt. Looks like the one reported missing from the freight office this morning." It was a lie, as blatant and ugly as the one about the raid. Chaska had carried no such weapon. Maeve watched, frozen in horror. From across the street, she saw the satisfaction in Harlan's eyes. He had his scapegoat. Chaska did not speak, did not resist as they bound his hands. To fight would be to give them the violence they craved, to confirm every dark prejudice the town held. He met her eyes for a fleeting second across the dusty street, and in his gaze she saw not fear, but a warning. Do nothing, not yet. They marched him to the jail and shoved him inside. The heavy door slammed shut, the sound echoing the closing of a tomb. The crowd dispersed, muttering their approval. Justice in Ash Hollow was swift and blind. Maeve felt hollowed out, the ledger against her skin now feeling like a block of ice. She stumbled back to the boarding house, her victory in the warehouse turned to ash in her mouth. She needed to think, to find a place of quiet, but the moment she pushed open the saloon door, she knew that would be impossible. The room was crowded, the air thick with smoke and the triumphant buzz of the mob. The two men who had mocked her upon her arrival were at the bar, drunker and louder than before. One of them saw her and a malicious grin spread across his face. "Well, look here," he bellowed, silencing the room. Her savage got himself caged, so she comes crawling back. Did not take you long to run out of wilderness to hide in. Every eye in the room turned to her. She was a specimen, a thing to be examined and judged. "What is the matter?" the other man sneered, stepping toward her. "Was he not man enough for you, or did you just not like the fleas?" Laughter, sharp and cruel, filled the room. Maeve stood her ground, her chin high, her hands clenched into fists at her sides. She would not let them see her break. The first man, emboldened by the crowd, reached out and grabbed her arm, his fingers digging into the flesh above her elbow. "Come on now, no need to be shy. We can show you what a real man is like." Panic, cold and sharp, lanced through her. She tried to pull away, but his grip was like iron. The circle of faces around her was a blur of leering grins and empty eyes. "That is quite enough. Mr. Henderson." The voice was female, calm, and cut through the noise like a surgeon's scalpel. The crowd parted. Standing there was a woman in a simple but well-made traveling suit, her hair pinned up with a severe efficiency. She carried a black leather bag. It was Dr. Lillian Ames, the town's only physician, a woman who had come west to practice medicine, not to find a husband, a fact that both impressed and unsettled the men of Ash Hollow. Henderson released Maeve's arm as if it had suddenly become hot. He shuffled his feet. "Just having a bit of fun. Dr. Ames." "Your idea of fun is tiresome," the doctor said, her gaze cool. "Miss O'Rourke, are you quite all right?" Maeve could only nod, her voice caught in her throat. Dr. Ames placed a steadying hand on her other arm. "Come, I believe you have had enough of this establishment for one day." She began to lead Maeve toward the stairs, the men shuffling back to make way, their bravado gone. As they passed a table near the back, a man stood to wipe it down with a rag. It was Sam Crow, a former slave who worked odd jobs for the railroad and the saloon, a man who moved through the town with a quiet invisibility. He did not look at her, his eyes fixed on the tabletop, but as she passed, his voice reached her, a whisper as soft as the rustle of dry leaves. "I saw them, the night before. Saw Pike's men move the real goods into the warehouse. Saw them burn the old wagon themselves out by the creek." The words were a lifeline thrown to a drowning woman. Maeve's head snapped toward him, but he was already moving away, his face a mask of deliberate ignorance. He had seen. He knew. He was a witness. Dr. Ames guided her up the stairs, her grip firm and reassuring. She said nothing of the whispered exchange, a silence that spoke of a deep and knowing discretion. She left Maeve at the door to her room with a simple, "Lock your door. The fever of this town has not yet broken." Maeve stumbled inside and through the bolt. She leaned against the door, her body trembling with a cocktail of fear, rage, and a tiny, dangerous flicker of hope. She pulled the ledger from her dress. It felt heavier now, weighted with the life of a man in a cell and the whispered words of another, trapped in a different kind of prison. The truth was no longer just hers, and it was a burden that was becoming too heavy to carry alone. Sleep was a country Maeve could not enter. She lay on her narrow bed, the locked door a flimsy shield against the malevolent silence of Ash Hollow. The town was not sleeping. It was waiting. She knew with a certainty that chilled her to the bone that Elias Pike and Sheriff Harlan would not allow Chaska to survive long enough for a circuit judge to arrive. There would be an incident, an escape attempt, a sudden illness, a convenient end to a man who knew too much, and a perfect final nail in the coffin of his people's reputation. The plan formed not as a bold stroke of strategy, but as a desperate whisper in the darkness. She could not storm the jail. She could not reason with the mob, but a prison wagon, moving on an open road, was a different thing. A machine, and machines could be made to fail. Hours before dawn, while the fog rolled in from the plains, thick and white and ghostly, Maeve slipped from the boarding house. She carried a heavy, discarded iron pin she had found near the blacksmith's forge, its weight a cold comfort in her hand. The prison wagon, a squat, reinforced box on wheels, was kept behind the sheriff's office. It was unguarded. Arrogance was Pike's greatest ally. Who in this town would dare to challenge him? Working in the cloying dampness, her breath pluming in the air, she examined the wagon's undercarriage, her fingers, raw from the cold, searched for a weakness. She found it in the heavy iron brace that secured the wagon box to the rear axle. It was held in place by a single, thick cotter pin. If that pin were to fail on a steep grade, the box would lose its anchor. It would slide. Her hands trembled, not just from the cold, but from the enormity of her task. She used the iron bar as a lever, working it into the tight space to pry at the pin. It was stiff, seated deep. Sweat beaded on her forehead, mingling with the fog's dampness. For a heart-stopping moment, she thought it would not move. Then, with a low groan of stressed metal, it shifted. She did not remove it entirely. She worked it out just enough so that it held by a fragile purchase, a treacherous promise of security that a hard jolt would shatter. She had scouted the path the day before. About a mile out of town, the road narrowed and climbed a steep, short hill before turning sharply. The outer edge of the turn was a tumble of loose rock and scree that fell away into a shallow, brush-choked ravine. She had spent an hour in the late afternoon rolling a few heavy, half-buried rocks into the path on the upward slope, making them look as if they had fallen there naturally. It was a simple, brutal trap. She retreated into the fog, finding a vantage point among a cluster of boulders that overlooked the hill, and then she waited. The waiting was the hardest part, a slow torment of doubt and fear. The rumble of the wagon came first, a low vibration in the earth, then the clop of hooves and the creak of wheels, all of it muffled by the dense fog. She could see them only as shapes, phantoms moving through a white void. Two figures on the driver's bench, Harlan and a deputy. The dark box behind them held Chaska. The wagon began its climb. She heard Harlan curse as the horses strained. Then came the jolt as the wheels struck the rocks she had placed. It was followed by a sharp, metallic crack, a sound that sliced through the fog and straight into Maeve's heart. The wagon lurched violently. A shout of alarm came from the driver's seat. The wagon box, its rear anchor severed, tilted backward, and with a grinding shriek of wood and metal, it slid off the undercarriage. It crashed down onto the road, tumbling end over end into the ravine with a final, splintering impact. The horses screamed and plunged, fighting the weight of the now unbalanced undercarriage. Harlan and his deputy were thrown from their seats, their shouts a mixture of pain and confusion. For a moment, there was only chaos, then a single gunshot, then another, fired blindly into the whiteout. Maeve did not wait to see more. She scrambled from her hiding place and ran, not toward the crash, but toward a prearranged meeting point they had silently agreed upon with a single glance the day before. A lone, twisted juniper tree on a distant ridge. He found her there as the fog began to burn away under the rising sun. He moved from the rocks like a spirit, silent and sudden. He was alive. He was free. But there was a dark, wet stain spreading across the buckskin on his left shoulder. He led her for hours, his pace unwavering despite his injury, pushing them deeper into the maze of canyons and dry washes that cut through the high plains. He did not speak, and she did not ask, saving her breath for the grueling trek. Finally, he brought them to a place that felt like the heart of the world's silence, a narrow, hidden canyon, its entrance shielded by a fall of ancient rock, a small spring seeping from the base of the wall, creating a patch of impossible green in the red landscape. Here, he finally allowed himself to rest, sinking to the ground with his back against the cool rock. The adrenaline that had sustained him was gone, and a gray, drawn look of pain had settled on his face. "You are hurt," Maeve said, her voice soft in the stillness. "It is a scratch," he said, but his attempt to move his arm ended in a sharp intake of breath. "Let me see. It was not a request." He hesitated, then gave a slow nod. Maeve knelt beside him. With gentle fingers, she tore the fabric of his shirt to expose the wound. A bullet had grazed him, plowing a deep, raw furrow through the flesh and muscle of his shoulder. It was bleeding sluggishly. The cloth stuck to the wound. She took the clean strip of linen she had used for her own arm, dipped it in the cold, clear water of the spring, and began to clean the injury. Her movements were steady and focused, her touch gentle. He was still, his jaw tight, but he did not pull away. In that small, quiet space, with the sun warming the rocks around them, an unspoken trust flowed between them. It was in the way he allowed her to care for him, and in the careful way her fingers worked, trying to bring him comfort, not pain. When she had cleaned and bandaged the wound as best she could, she sat back on her heels. The tension of the last 2 days, the fear, the violence, the desperate gamble in the fog, all of it crested inside her. A single tear tracked a clean path through the grime on her cheek. Then another. Soon, her shoulders were shaking with silent, racking sobs. It was a grief that went deeper than the immediate danger. It was the accumulated sorrow of a lifetime. "They do not see me," she whispered, the words torn from a place she kept locked away. "When they look at me, the men in the saloon, the people in every town I have ever been in, they see something to be scorned, a face to be laughed at. They call me plain or ugly. It is the first thing they see, and it is the only thing they see. It is like being a ghost that everyone can mock." She looked at him, her vision blurred with tears, expecting to see pity or perhaps discomfort. Instead, his dark eyes were fixed on her, his expression one of intense, unwavering focus, as if he were memorizing the lines of her face. He reached out, not to touch her, but his hand hovered in the air between them, a gesture of profound respect. "I see the woman you are," he said. His voice was a low rumble, as solid as the rock behind him. The words were simple, but they landed in the deepest part of her, a place that had been hollow and aching for as long as she could remember. He did not say she was beautiful. He did not offer a lie. He said he saw her, the real her, the one who had survived, who had fought, who had just freed him with nothing but her wits and a piece of iron. He moved closer then, and gently cupped her face in his hands, his thumbs brushing away her tears. He leaned in and touched his lips to hers. It was not a kiss of fire or passion, but of recognition. It was warm and firm and held no demand. It was a quiet claiming, an answer to a question she had been too afraid to even ask herself. It was a promise that she was seen, and that she was worthy. When he pulled back, the canyon was the same. The sun was in the same place in the sky, but everything inside Maeve had shifted. The wall she had so carefully built around her heart had a door in it now, and he had just walked through. "Pike will not stop," she said, her voice still thick with emotion. "They will hunt us." "Let them hunt," Chaska replied. "We are no longer the prey." "I will not be a burden to you," she insisted, a flicker of the old fear returning. He took her hand, his fingers lacing through hers. His grip was strong. "We carry this together now," he said, his gaze meeting hers. "Through the storm, through the bullets. We do not leave the other behind." It was a vow, made in the heart of the wilderness, witnessed only by the ancient, silent rocks. They were two people, a dispossessed warrior and a woman the world had discarded, and they had only each other. For a few hours, the canyon was their sanctuary. They shared the last of their dried meat and drank from the spring. A quiet peace settled between them, a fragile thing in a violent world. But as the afternoon sun began to dip toward the high canyon walls, casting long shadows on the ground, Maeve saw Chaska stiffen. His gaze was fixed on the far ridge, a hard, focused line. She followed his eyes. At first, she saw nothing but rock and sky. Then she saw it, a tiny flicker of light, impossibly bright, the sun glinting off something metal. A rifle barrel. A lone rider, a dark speck against the horizon, was watching their sanctuary. The hunt had already begun. There was no time for words. The glint of light from the ridge was a death sentence written in the language of the sun. Chaska was moving before the light had faded, pulling Maeve to her feet, his grip like iron on her arm. His face was a mask of cold fury and calculation. The sanctuary was gone. The hunt was on. He did not choose an easy path. He led her away from the spring, scrambling up a steep wall of fractured rock that would have been difficult for a goat. He moved with a focused, desperate energy, his injured shoulder a liability he simply ignored. Maeve followed, her lungs burning, her muscles screaming in protest. The quiet intimacy of the canyon felt a world away, a dream shattered by the harsh reality of their flight. Behind them, shouts echoed off the stone walls. They had been seen, 3 riders fanning out at the mouth of their hidden canyon, beginning the slow, patient work of tracking them. Chaska pushed the pace, leading them into a vast, desolate field of boulders, a chaotic jumble of stone the size of small cabins. It was a place designed to break an ankle or twist a knee, a landscape that offered 1,000 places to hide and 1,000 places to be trapped. The sky, which had been a clear, unforgiving blue, began to curdle, turning the color of a fresh bruise. A cold wind whipped through the rocks, carrying the smell of rain. The first drops were fat and slow, kicking up puffs of red dust. Then the heavens opened. A cold, driving rain began to fall, turning the world into a gray, streaming blur. It soaked them in seconds, plastering their clothes to their skin, chilling them to the bone. The rain was a blessing and a curse. It would wash away their tracks, but it turned the surfaces of the great stones to slick, treacherous glass. They pressed on, slipping and sliding, their hands raw from gripping the wet, gritty rock. Once, Chaska's foot went out from under him, and he landed hard, a sharp, ragged gasp of pain escaping his lips as his wounded shoulder took the impact. Maeve was at his side instantly, helping him up, her face a mask of concern. He did not acknowledge the pain, his eyes already scanning the rocks ahead, searching for the next handhold, the next path. The pursuers were closer now. Their dark shapes moved through the gray curtain of rain, less certain on the slick terrain, but still advancing, still relentless. They were being herded, pushed toward a high, sheer rock face that offered no escape. They found themselves on a wide, flat ledge, a dead end. Below them was a 30-foot drop. Above, a sheer, unclimbable wall. To their left and right, the boulder field. And coming through the boulders, taking his time now, was one of Pike's men, a rifle held at the ready. He was a thick, bearded man, his face set in a grim expression of satisfaction. He had them. Chaska pushed Maeve behind him, his body a shield. He held only a knife. The man raised his rifle, the rain dripping from the brim of his hat. He was in no hurry. He was enjoying the moment. "Nowhere left to run," he called out, his voice rough. In that instant, Maeve saw it. Tucked into the back of Chaska's belt was the pistol Harlan had used to frame him, the one Chaska must have taken from the deputy in the chaos of the crash. Her mind, which had been a storm of fear, suddenly became icily calm. She had seen her father shoot rabbits back in Ireland, a lifetime ago. She remembered the stillness, the slow breath, the gentle squeeze. She pulled the heavy pistol from Chaska's belt. He glanced at her, his eyes questioning, but he did not stop her. The weight of it was immense, a solid piece of deadly iron. She raised it with both hands, the barrel shaking. She looked at the man, at his cold eyes, and knew she could not kill him. But his horse, a big roan, stood a few feet to his left, nervously shifting its weight on the wet stone. Maeve took a slow breath, held it, and squeezed the trigger. The explosion was deafening, echoing off the rock walls. The pistol bucked in her hands. The horse screamed, a high, terrifying sound, and reared, its front legs lashing the air. It stumbled sideways on the slick rock, its legs going out from under it. The rifleman, caught by surprise, was thrown from the saddle, his weapon clattering on the stones. He landed with a sickening thud and did not move. The other two riders, hearing the shot and the horse's scream, paused in their advance. Chaska did not waste the moment Maeve had bought them. He grabbed her hand and pulled her along the ledge, back the way they came, into a narrow fissure she had not seen before. They scrambled through the tight passage, the rock scraping at their clothes, and emerged on the other side of the rock face, hidden from view. They ran, a desperate, stumbling flight, until the sounds of the pursuit faded behind them, swallowed by the rain and the vast, indifferent stone. Hours later, as the rain softened to a miserable drizzle, Chaska led her to a place of shelter. It was a deep overhang on the side of a butte, the ground beneath it dry and sandy. A small, smokeless fire already burned there, and several figures rose to greet them as they approached. They were Lakota, an older man with a face like a weathered map, his long hair streaked with gray, stepped forward. This was Mazaska. He greeted Chaska with a hand on his good shoulder, his eyes taking in the fresh bandage, then moving to Maeve, his gaze penetrating but not unkind. Chaska spoke in the soft, flowing cadence of his own language. The words were a mystery to Maeve, but the tone was one of urgency and respect. Mazaska listened, his expression unchanging, his gaze occasionally shifting to her. When Chaska finished, Mazaska spoke, his voice low and resonant. Chaska translated. "He says that the man Pike is a coyote. He sets a trap not for the wolf, but for the bear. He wishes the Lakota to answer violence with violence. He wishes for a war he knows we cannot win, so that the soldiers will come and drive all of our people from these lands forever." "Then what can we do?" Maeve asked, her voice trembling with exhaustion and cold. "We do not spring the trap," Chaska said, conveying Mazaska's words. "We do not give him the war he wants. There is another path, a harder one, the path of the truth." A young woman, Anpetu, brought Maeve a warm, dry blanket and a bowl of hot broth. The simple kindness, after so much violence, almost brought her to tears. She sat by the fire, wrapped in the thick wool, and listened as the Lakota men spoke. Their faces were grim. They understood the stakes. Their homes, their families, their very existence was being threatened by a rich man's lie. But they would not be provoked. Their patience was a weapon, a form of resistance Pike could not comprehend. The discussion was interrupted by a sound from the edge of the camp. One of the sentries called out. A figure was stumbling through the drizzle toward them, A boy, his clothes torn, his face pale with fear and exhaustion. Maeve's heart stopped. It was Finn Quinn. He saw her and collapsed at her feet, gasping for breath. He was clutching a small book wrapped in oilskin. His eyes were wild with a terror that was more than just physical exhaustion. "I had to," he choked out, pushing the book into her hands. "I heard them. Pike and the sheriff. They were talking about you, about your family. They said they had plans for my mother if I spoke a word. But I took this from Pike's office. Mama, she sometimes holds things for him. I saw it. It has the real lists. Everything." He was confessing, his words tumbling out in a rush of guilt and fear. He had done a brave, foolish, terrible thing. Before Maeve could even process what he was saying, a single, sharp crack echoed from the rocks above. It was not thunder. It was a rifle shot. Finn cried out, a short, sharp sound of surprise, and arched his back. He crumpled forward onto the sandy ground. A dark, wet patch blossomed on the back of his thin cotton shirt, spreading with horrifying speed. Chaos erupted. The Lakota were instantly in motion, not attacking, but defending, pulling back into the deeper cover of the overhang, their own weapons appearing in their hands. Chaska threw himself in front of Maeve, shielding her, his eyes scanning the rimrock for the shooter. Maeve knelt beside Finn, her hands hovering over him. Useless. The oilskin book had fallen from her grasp. She could only stare at the boy, at his pale face, at the blood that was now beginning to pool on the ground beneath him. The rain continued to fall, a steady, weeping drizzle, washing over the flat gray stone at the edge of the shelter. It mingled with the crimson stain of Finn's blood, the water and the lifeblood swirling together. She had brought this here. Her quest for justice, her desperate flight, had led this boy, this innocent, to lie bleeding at her feet. The truth had a price, and it was being paid in the blood of a child on a cold stone in the rain. The world dissolved into a maelstrom of motion and sound. Mazaska's voice, a low, powerful command, cut through the panic. Two of his men returned fire toward the high rocks, not to hit the unseen shooter, but to provide a screen of noise and smoke. Chaska, his face a granite mask of pain and fury, grabbed Maeve and pulled her into the deepest part of the rock overhang. The bullet had come for him. He knew, but it had found the boy instead. Enpetu and another woman were already at Finn's side, their movements deft and practiced. They turned him gently. The exit wound was a ragged, terrible thing in his chest. He was alive, but only just. His breath a shallow, hitching whisper. Guilt, sharp and suffocating. Seized Maeve. This was her fault. Her pursuit of the truth had led this boy into the path of a bullet meant for her or Chaska. There was no time for grief. The sniper's shot was not an ending. It was a signal. Pike's men knew where they were. They had to move, and they had to move now. Mazaska gave the order. A travois was fashioned from 2 long poles and a blanket, a crude, rolling bed for the unconscious boy. They moved out, not back toward Ash Hollow, but deeper into the wilderness, climbing toward the high, broken country where the seasons turned first and hardest. The rain, which had been a miserable drizzle, began to change. It grew colder, turning to a stinging sleet that coated the rocks in a treacherous glaze. The journey was a special kind of hell. They moved as fast as they could, with 2 men pulling the travois, the poles bumping and jostling the wounded boy with every step. Maeve walked beside him, trying to shield his face from the sleet, her heart aching with every pained sound he made. Chaska took the rear, his eyes constantly scanning their back trail, his pistol in his hand. The strain of the climb and the tension of the pursuit pulled at his own wound, and Maeve could see a thin line of sweat on his brow, a sheen that had nothing to do with exertion and everything to do with a brewing fever. By evening, the sleet had turned to snow. It was an early, unnatural storm, a freak of the high country, and it descended with a silent, remorseless fury. The flakes were thick and wet, clinging to everything. muffling sound and erasing the world. They found shelter in a deep, narrow valley. A box canyon with walls so high they seemed to hold up the heavy, gray sky. A series of shallow caves, little more than deep indentations in the rock, offered some protection from the wind, which now howled over the rim of the canyon like a hungry animal. They were trapped. The snow that had been their salvation, covering their tracks and forcing their pursuers to turn back, was now their jailer. It piled in deep drifts at the mouth of the valley, sealing them in. The days that followed blurred into a single, grinding struggle for survival. The world was reduced to the elemental realities of cold, hunger, and fear. The temperature plummeted. Their small store of dried meat was quickly exhausted. The men hunted, but the game had been driven to shelter by the storm. They returned with nothing but a few scrawny grouse. Hunger became a constant, gnawing presence. A cold ache in the belly that mirrored the cold in their bones. And then came the wolves. They did not see them at first, only heard them, their long, lonely howls echoing from the canyon rim at night. A wild and mournful chorus. They were a constant reminder that they were not the only hungry creatures in this frozen world, that they too were meat. In this crucible of hardship, Maeve found a strength she never knew she possessed, the self-pity, the shame that had been her constant companion for so long, was burned away by the sheer, brutal necessity of the moment. She learned. Anpetu, the young Lakota woman with quiet, capable hands, showed her how to set snares for rabbits along the edge of the brush line, using horsehair and twisted sinew. Maeve learned the grim anatomy of the animal, how to skin it with a sharp flint and stretch the precious hide. She learned to make a thin, watery soup that was more hope than sustenance. She learned to build a small, nearly smokeless fire in the back of the cave, using dry willow and arranging the wood so that it burned from the top down. A trick that kept them from being a beacon in the white wilderness. These were not the skills of a seamstress. They were the skills of a survivor. Her most solemn duty was to Finn. He lingered in a state between life and death. The bullet had passed through, but the damage was immense. Maeve and Anpetu kept the wound clean, but without proper medicine, infection was a certainty. Maeve sat with him for hours, wiping his brow with a cool, damp cloth, whispering to him, telling him stories of the green hills of her home, a place as far from this frozen desolation as the moon. She did not know if he could hear her, but she spoke anyway, a quiet penance for the part she had played in his ruin. The second blow fell on the fourth day. Chaska's fever, which had been a low, simmering fire, finally erupted. His wound was hot and swollen, an angry red that spoke of the poison spreading through his blood. By nightfall, he was delirious, his mind lost in a landscape of fragmented memories and shadows. He spoke in his own language, his voice a hoarse rasp, and in his fevered dreams, he fought old battles, his good arm lashing out at enemies only he could see. Maeve's world shrank to the confines of the small cave. Mazaska and the others kept their distance, their faces grim, a silent acknowledgement of the fragility of life. Now, both the boy and the warrior were in her care. She sat between them, a solitary guardian, moving from one to the other, cooling their brows, forcing sips of water between their cracked lips. Hope was a flickering ember, and the wind blowing through the valley was doing its best to extinguish it. In the long, desperate hours, when the only sounds were the howling wind and the labored breathing of the two men, Maeve pulled out the small, oilskin-wrapped book Finn had given her, Pike's Ledger. She untied the covering. Inside, the pages were filled with his precise, damning script. It was all there, the true inventories, the secret marks, the architecture of his great lie. She had to do something more than just survive. If they died here, if the wolves or the cold or the fever claimed them all, the truth could not die with them. She found a piece of charcoal from the fire and, on the blank pages at the back of the ledger, she began to write. Her fingers were stiff with cold, her handwriting a clumsy scrawl, but the words poured out of her. She wrote of the conversation she had overheard behind the stable. She wrote of Sheriff Harlan's complicity. She wrote of Sam Crow's whispered confession. She wrote down everything, a testament for a world that might never read it. As she wrote, the image of the old, dusty printing press in Pike's warehouse rose in her mind, a sleeping giant, a voice for the truth. If only it could be woken. Writing was an act of faith, a single candle lit against an overwhelming darkness. On the 6th day, a figure appeared at the mouth of the valley. It was a lone rider, moving slowly through the deep snow on a sturdy mountain pony. One of Maza Ska's men raised a rifle, but another lowered it, his voice sharp with disbelief. The rider was a woman. It was Dr. Lillian Ames. She was bundled in furs, her face red from the wind, her expression one of grim determination. Slung over her saddle was her black medical bag. She had come through the storm, a journey that would have tested the strongest man, armed with nothing but her knowledge and her will. Sam Crow, she explained as Maeve helped her from the pony, had seen them flee into the high country. He did not trust the law, but he trusted the doctor. He had gone to her in the night, and she had set out at first light, before the worst of the storm hit, following the trail until the snow had erased it, and then simply pushing on, trusting her instincts and the general direction Sam had given her. She wasted no time. She knelt beside Finn, her examination swift and sure. "He is young. He is strong," she said, her voice a balm of professional calm. "But the infection is deep." She opened her bag and took out a bottle of carbolic acid and clean bandages. Then she turned to Chaska. She assessed his fever, examined the angry wound. "This is bad," she murmured, "but not hopeless." She worked through the day and into the night, a quiet, efficient force of healing in the desperate cave. She lanced Chaska's wound to drain the poison, a brutal but necessary procedure. She cleaned Finn's injury with the powerful antiseptic. She administered laudanum for the pain and quinine for the fevers. She brought more than just medicine. She brought the quiet, unshakable authority of science into a place that had been ruled by primal fear. As she worked, she spoke in a low voice to Maeve. "Pike has consolidated his position. He and Harlan have convinced the town that the Lakota took you and their brave deputy, who they say was killed in the escape. They have sent for the territorial cavalry. They are using this to get everything they want." The news was a cold weight in Maeve's stomach. They were running out of time. The next morning, the world was transformed. The storm had broken. The wind had died. A brilliant, blinding sun shone from a sky of the purest blue, making the endless expanse of new snow glitter as if it were scattered with diamonds. The air was still and cold and clean. Inside the cave, Chaska's fever had broken. He was weak and pale, but his eyes were clear, and he knew where he was. Finn was still unconscious, but his breathing was deeper, more regular. They had survived. They had been tested by the fire of winter, and they had endured. The hope that had been a flickering ember was now a small but steady flame. The storm outside was over. Now, they had to prepare to face the one that was gathering in Ash Hollow. The journey back was a descent from a white purgatory into a world of mud and shadow. The great snow was melting under the relentless sun, turning the canyons into treacherous rivers of slush and the plains into vast, sucking mires. They left Finn in the care of Anpetu and another woman, his life a fragile flame that Dr. Ames had coaxed back from the edge of extinction. Maza Ska gave them his blessing, a solemn hand on Chaska's good shoulder. His path was to hold his people back from Pike's trap, to endure. Theirs was to go forward and dismantle it. Chaska, though his fever was gone, moved with a weary stiffness, a deep ache in his bones that the cold had settled into. Yet his eyes were sharp, missing nothing, reading the half-thawed earth for signs of their enemies. Dr. Ames proved as tireless on the trail as she was in a sick room, her resolve a thing of quiet, unbending steel, and Maeve, with Pike's ledger wrapped in its oilskin and tucked deep inside her worn coat, felt a new and unfamiliar sensation. It was not courage, for she was still terrified. It was purpose. A cold, clear purpose that burned brighter than her fear. They did not dare approach Ash Hollow by day. They waited in a rocky coulee miles from town as the sun set, painting the wet, bruised land in shades of violet and blood. Under the first pale stars, Chaska led them forward. They moved like ghosts, following the shallow depressions of buffalo trails, their footsteps making no sound on the damp earth. Their destination was the livery stable at the edge of town. Sam Crow was waiting for them in the deep darkness behind the building, the familiar smell of hay and horse a comforting anchor in the tense night. He was a silhouette, his face a knot of anxiety. He told them Pike was growing bolder, that he and the sheriff were planning a public hearing in 2 days to officially condemn the Lakota for the raid, for the death of the deputy, for everything. He spoke of the territorial cavalry, a name that hung in the air like the promise of an execution. Maeve explained their plan, her voice a low, urgent whisper. She spoke of the printing press, the sleeping giant in Pike's own warehouse. Sam Crow shook his head, his fear palpable. He said the warehouse was watched, but then Maeve showed him the ledger. She held it open in the faint starlight, and though he could not read the words, he understood what it was. He looked from the book to Dr. Ames, a woman he respected, and then to Chaska, a man he knew was innocent. A long, shuddering sigh escaped him. He told them there was a way, a coal chute on the far side, seldom used and likely forgotten. He had the key for the service door. He would help. The 4 of them moved through the back alleys of the sleeping town, a small, desperate alliance against the power that owned this place. The warehouse loomed before them, a black, silent monolith. Chaska scouted the perimeter, a shadow among shadows, before giving a soft call like a night bird to signal it was clear. Sam's key turned in the lock with a loud, grating click that made them all freeze, but no alarm was raised. They slipped inside. The air was stagnant and thick with the smell of old paper and settled dust. Sam lit a small, shielded lantern, its weak yellow glow pushing back the immense darkness but creating a small, vulnerable circle of light. In the center of the vast space, under a canvas shroud, was the press. It looked like a monument in a forgotten tomb. Maeve pulled back the canvas. The machine was a beautiful, complicated beast of iron and brass. It was covered in a fine layer of grime, its gears choked with the dust of disuse. It was the voice of the town, and it had been silenced for a long time. They set to work, a quiet, frantic team. Chaska stood guard at the door, his stillness a perfect counterpoint to the urgent energy inside. Sam, who had worked on every kind of machine from cotton gins to railroad engines, examined the press with a knowing eye. He pointed to a drive belt that had gone slack, to a gear whose teeth were clogged with hardened grease. Dr. Ames produced a small bottle of oil from her medical bag, and Maeve, her fingers nimble from years of needlework, cleaned the delicate parts with a rag, her touch as careful as a surgeon's. For an hour, the only sounds were the soft scraping of metal, the whisper of the rag, the low murmur of Sam's instructions. Finally, he nodded. He put his shoulder to the great flywheel. It resisted, groaning in protest. Then, with a shudder that ran through the whole machine, it began to turn. A slow, rhythmic clank and whir filled the space, the sound of a heart starting to beat again. It was the most beautiful music Maeve had ever heard. Now her work began. While Sam prepared the ink and paper, Maeve took out the compositor's stick and the heavy wooden cases of lead type. Her hands were cold, but her mind was clear. She began to set the words, picking each tiny metal letter from its compartment, arranging them into a mirror image of the truth. It was slow, meticulous work, a craft of patience and precision. She composed a simple, powerful message. At the top, in large, bold letters, she set the title, The Truth of Ash Hollow. Below, she laid out the facts, one by one. like stones in a foundation. She wrote of Pike's ledger, with its proof of goods delivered before they were ever stolen. She described the secret blue mark, the circle with the P, and with a piece of charcoal. She carefully drew the symbol on a small stack of paper to be included with each flyer. She wrote of Sam Crow's testimony, how he saw Pike's men set fire to their own wagon. She wrote of Finn Quinn's courage, how a boy had risked his life to bring forth the truth, and how he had been shot by a man hiding in the rocks. At the bottom of the page, she set the final, damning lines. She wrote that this testimony was sworn and true, and beneath that, she set the name of Dr. Lillian Ames, a name that carried the weight of integrity and honor. Sam took the first composed plate and locked it into the press. He inked the rollers, laid a sheet of paper, and pulled the great lever. The machine sighed and pressed down. He peeled the paper off. It was a thing of stark, undeniable power. The words were black and sharp, a weapon made of ink and truth. As they worked, printing sheet after sheet, Sam grew restless. He told them he needed to see what was happening in town, to listen. He slipped out into the darkness and was gone for what felt like an eternity. When he returned, his face was ashen, his eyes wide with a new urgency. He told them their time had run out. Harlan was not even waiting for the public hearing. That very night, a special train car was being loaded at the rail spur. It was filled with goods, crates marked with the railroad's insignia. Harlan was telling everyone it was a shipment of irrefutable evidence, items recovered from a Lakota camp. But Sam had seen Pike's men loading it, had seen the same blue mark on the crates. It was another lie, a final, spectacular piece of theater designed to inflame the coming cavalry and seal the fate of Mazaska's people forever. They were not just exposing a past crime. They had to stop one that was happening right now. The rhythm of the press quickened. They worked with a desperate, frantic energy, the stack of flyers growing with every pull of the lever. They had to wake the town before Pike's train could roll. In the hour before dawn, the darkest and quietest time, they became insurgents. They split into two teams. Chaska and Sam moved with a stealthy speed, while Maeve and Dr. Ames followed, their arms laden with the flimsy sheets of paper that felt as heavy as stone tablets. They moved down the main street and through the alleys, a silent army of four. They tacked the flyers to the door of the saloon, on the window of the mercantile, on the raw lumber of the new buildings. Maeve herself, with a feeling of grim satisfaction, pressed one firmly to the wood of the new telegraph pole, that symbol of Pike's power. They retreated to the shadows of the livery to watch the town wake up. The first man to see a flyer was a blacksmith's assistant on his way to light the forge. He stopped, read it, and his face, illuminated by the rising sun, was a study in confusion, then dawning anger. He did not tear it down. He folded it carefully and put it in his pocket. A few minutes later, one of Pike's railroad foremen saw one on the saloon door. He glanced around, then ripped it from the wood, crumpled it in his fist, and threw it into the mud. The scene was repeated all over town. People gathered in small, murmuring groups. Some read with grim faces, others shouted, calling the flyers lies. The words, the simple black ink on white paper, had fallen into the heart of Ash Hollow, and the town was beginning to fracture along the fault lines of conscience and fear. The sun was fully up now, casting long shadows down the dusty street. Their work was done. The truth was loose in the world. They had struck a blow with words, but they all knew that Pike and Harlan would not answer with words. Their answer would come with the setting of the sun, on a railroad car filled with lies. And it would be an answer written in violence and fire. The sun set on a town holding its breath. The flyers had done their work. They had not united the people, but divided them, forcing a choice between a comfortable lie and a dangerous truth. As darkness fell, a raw, gusting wind swept down from the high plains, kicking up dust and rattling the window panes of the silent houses. It was a hunter's wind, a wind for a final reckoning. Under the cover of that restless night, The four allies met for the last time in the deep shadows of the livery stable. Their plan was desperate, a gamble against a stacked deck. Chaska and Sam Crow would move toward the rail spur, where a handful of broke and intimidated railroad workers were being forced by Pike's foreman to act as a staged raiding party. Their job was to free those men, to turn coerced actors into willing witnesses. Maeve and Dr. Ames had the second, more perilous task. They had to get to the sealed train car, the one Pike and Harlan called their evidence, and mark it for all to see. They moved separately through the darkness, two pairs of ghosts on a mission to haunt the guilty. The rail yard was a maze of tracks and silent cars, the air thick with the smell of coal smoke and hot iron. A single engine hissed steam under the weak light of a few yard lamps, preparing to move the car of lies. Maeve and Dr. Ames found the car on a siding, a dark, windowless box guarded by a single, bored-looking deputy. They circled around, using a line of freight cars as cover, and approached from the blind side. Maeve's heart was a frantic drum against her ribs. She carried a shielded lantern and a piece of charcoal. In her pocket was a signal flare, a bright red firework salvaged from the railroad's emergency supplies. While the doctor kept watch, Maeve hoisted herself up onto the coupling between the cars. She held the lantern close to the wood. There it was, faint but unmistakable in the yellow light. The stenciled blue circle with the letter P, Pike's secret mark, the signature of his crime. She worked quickly, her fingers numb with cold and fear, sketching the symbol and its location on a spare flyer, her charcoal scratching loudly in the tense silence. She needed proof that could be seen from a distance. Meanwhile, Chaska and Sam had reached the small camp where the captive workers were being held, just beyond the edge of the yard lights. Pike's foreman and two other hired thugs stood guard, passing a bottle between them. The workers, a half-dozen men with the gaunt, hopeless faces of the truly destitute, huddled around a small fire. Chaska did not attack with sound and fury. He and Sam moved like the wind itself, two dark shapes detaching from the deeper darkness. There was a sudden, muffled scuffle, the grunt of a man taken by surprise, the thud of a body hitting the hard ground. Before the others could react, Chaska was on them, moving with a fluid, disabling economy. Sam Crow. His fear burned away and replaced by a cold, righteous anger. Disarmed the last man with a powerful swing of a heavy iron pry bar. The fight was over in less than a minute. Chaska spoke to the freed workers, his voice low and urgent. He did not command them. He offered them a choice. They could run, or they could stay and see justice done. They stayed. Back at the train car, the engine gave a loud hiss of steam and jolted forward. The car was being moved. Maeve almost lost her footing, scrambling to get down before she was crushed. The car was being coupled to the small engine, ready for its journey. It would be taken to the main line, and then onto the territorial capital, where Pike's lies would become official history. There was only one chance left. The train had to cross a short wooden trestle bridge that spanned a deep, dry wash about 100 yards from the station. Maeve and the doctor ran, keeping low, their lungs aching in the cold air. As the engine began its slow, clanking journey out of the yard, Dr. Ames broke away, heading not for the bridge but toward the center of town, toward the tall, silent steeple of the church. Maeve reached the trestle and scrambled down the steep embankment into the darkness of the dry wash below. She looked up through the skeletal framework of the timbers. The engine was approaching, its single headlamp cutting a white, ghostly tunnel through the night. She heard a shout from above. One of Pike's men, a bull of a man she recognized from the saloon, was riding on top of the car. And then she saw another figure leap from the embankment onto the tracks in front of the slow-moving engine. It was Chaska. The engineer saw him and slammed on the brakes, the wheels shrieking on the rails. The train shuddered to a halt right in the middle of the bridge. Chaska and the big man met on the narrow walkway beside the tracks. A brutal, desperate fight silhouetted against the engine's light. This was her moment. Maeve held the shielded lantern up to the side of the car. There were 3 heavy crates stacked near the door, lashed down with rope. The blue mark was visible on the bottom one. The rope was secured to an iron ring on the side of the car with a single locking pin. Above her, the fight raged. She could hear the impact of fists, the grunts of exertion. She pulled a heavy wrench from her coat, a tool Sam had given her, and attacked the pin. It was stiff, rusted in place. She threw all her weight against it, the metal groaning in protest. Then, a sound cut through the night, pure and clear and urgent. Rising above the wind and the hissing of the engine, the sound of the church bell. One peal, then another, then a frantic, insistent ringing. It was a summons, a fire alarm for the soul of the town. The pin gave way. With a loud crack, the rope went slack. The top 2 crates held, but the bottom one, the one with the mark, shifted, tilted, and then plunged over the side of the bridge. It fell the 20 feet to the dry wash, landing with a tremendous, splintering crash that echoed like a gunshot. The crate burst open. Its contents spilled out onto the rocks. It was not recovered evidence. It was sacks of flour, tins of coffee, and bolts of cloth. The mundane contents of a general store. And on a large, splintered piece of the crate, caught perfectly in the spill of light from Maeve's lantern, was the blue-painted circle with the P inside. A perfect match to Finn's ledger and the drawing on her flyer. Up on the bridge, Chaska used the distraction to end the fight, sending his opponent tumbling into the brush. But it was too late for stealth. Lights were appearing in the windows of the town. Shouts echoed in the streets. The bell kept ringing. A relentless call to witness. A crowd was forming, drawn by the bell and the stopped train, moving like a river toward the station. Maeve scrambled up the embankment, the flyer with her charcoal sketch clutched in her hand. The crowd was a confused, angry mass of people, their faces pale in the lantern light. Sheriff Harlan was there, trying to restore order, his face a mask of fury. And beside him stood Elias Pike, his fine coat flapping in the wind, his expression one of icy calm. Sam Crow stepped out of the crowd, planting himself in front of the sheriff. He held up a flyer. "It is all here," he said, his voice ringing with a newfound authority, just like it says. "Go look. The crate is broken in the wash. The mark is on it, the mark that proves he is the thief." Harlan shoved him back. "Get out of my way. This is official railroad business." The crowd murmured, pressing closer. They had read the flyers. They had heard the bell. Now they saw the broken crate. Doubt was a contagion, spreading from person to person. Pike saw it was all unraveling. He saw Maeve standing at the edge of the light, the source of it all. His icy calm finally broke. He pulled a small, silver pistol from his coat pocket and pointed it directly at her. "This ends now," he said, his voice flat and deadly. Everything seemed to happen in slow motion. Chaska, coming from the bridge, saw the gun. He launched himself forward. A desperate, silent dive. The gun fired. The flash, a brilliant orange flower in the night. Chaska cried out, not a loud shout, but a sharp, guttural sound of impact as he crashed into Maeve, sending them both tumbling to the ground. The crowd gasped, a single, collective intake of breath. For a moment, the whole world was silent save for the tolling bell and the howling wind. Pike stood, the pistol still extended, his face a mask of reptilian hate. Then the spell broke. The blacksmith, a giant of a man, stepped forward and wrenched the pistol from Pike's hand as if taking a toy from a child. Several other men grabbed Pike, holding him fast. His power, built on fear and lies, had vanished in the flash of a gun. Harlan, his face white with terror, tried to back away, but Sam Crow stood in his path. "Your lies are over, Sheriff," Sam said, his voice quiet but carrying over the crowd. He pointed to the broken crate, then to the flyer. "It matches. The boy's book, the flyer, the crate, it all matches. You are a liar and a thief." One of the deputies, A young, uncertain man who had always stood in Harlan's shadow looked at the evidence, at the crowd, at the captured Pike, and made a decision. He walked up to Harlan. "Clay," he said, his voice shaking but firm. "Give me the badge." Harlan stared at him, his mouth opening and closing, but no words came out. The deputy reached out and unpinned the tin star from Harlan's vest. He held it in his palm, the symbol of a law that had been bought and sold, and was now, finally, being reclaimed. The crowd watched, silent and grim. Justice had not come from a judge or the cavalry. It had risen from the mud and dust of their own street, summoned by a bell, and paid for in courage. The gunshot's echo was swallowed by the sudden, profound silence of the crowd. For a heartbeat, the world was a frozen tableau Pike held fast by angry men, the deputy holding the tarnished star, and Maeve on the hard, cold ground with Chaska's dead weight pinning her down. Her first thought was a white flash of terror, not for herself, but for him. He had taken the bullet meant for her. Then he groaned, a low, pained sound that was the most beautiful thing she had ever heard. The bullet had not been a clean miss. It had torn through the thick muscle of his arm, a searing path of fire, but it had not found bone or his heart. Dr. Ames was at their side in an instant, her authority a tangible force in the chaos. "Help me get him to my office," she commanded, and hands that had moments before been clenched in anger were now gentle, lifting Chaska with a care that transcended the divisions of the last weeks. The spell of violence was broken. The town of Ash Hollow, which had been a tinderbox of rumor and hate, had seen the truth in a flash of gunpowder. Pike offered no resistance as the blacksmith and 2 railroad hands bound his wrists. His arrogance had shattered, leaving only a hollow, venomous shell. Harlan, his face the color of old dough, allowed the young deputy to lead him away to the jail cell he himself had so recently filled. The law, however crude and impromptu, was taking its course. The days that followed were quiet, possessed of a strange, fragile peace. The wind died down, and the sun shone on a town that was looking at itself in a new and uncomfortable light. Pike was gone, taken away by a pair of grim federal marshals who had arrived on the morning train, summoned by a telegraph message from the acting deputy. Harlan remained in his cell, a deflated tyrant awaiting the arrival of the circuit judge. The great oppressive weight of their power had been lifted, and in its absence, the people of Ash Hollow began to breathe again. Maeve spent most of her time in the small, clean infirmary Dr. Ames maintained behind her office. Chaska's wound was painful but clean. The doctor had removed the bullet, and now healing was a matter of time and rest. Maeve changed his bandages, brought him broth, and simply sat with him, the silence between them more eloquent than any words. The shared ordeal had forged a bond that needed no sound. On the 3rd day, she went to the Quinn's boarding house. Nora Quinn met her at the door, her face etched with a sorrow that had aged her 10 years. She led Maeve upstairs to Finn's room. The boy was awake, pale and thin, but his eyes were clear. The fever was gone. He looked at Maeve, and his face crumpled with a shame that was profound and heartbreaking. "I am so sorry," he whispered, his voice weak. "I was a coward. I heard them talking, and I was afraid for my mother, but I should have said something." "You did say something, Finn," Maeve said softly, taking his hand. It felt as fragile as a bird's wing. "You brought the truth. You were braver than anyone." He gave a weak shake of his head. He had given a full, detailed statement to the deputy, confirming everything in Maeve's flyer and adding details only he could have known. He directed the deputy to a loose floorboard in his mother's room where he had hidden Pike's ledger. It was the final, irrefutable piece of evidence. His confession had sealed Pike's and Harlan's fates. Nora stood in the doorway, weeping silently, her tears a mixture of grief for her son's pain and a fierce, wrenching pride. The town, shamed and shaken, knew it could not wait for a distant judge to pass sentence on its soul. The young deputy, whose name was Miller, organized a town meeting. It was held in the saloon, the very room where Maeve had been mocked and threatened. But the atmosphere was different now. The air was not thick with smoke and malice, but with a somber, determined quiet. It was not a trial of Pike or Harlan, but a trial of the town itself. Miller stood on a crate and presided over the hearing. Sam Crow was the first to speak. He stood tall, his hands clasped behind his back, and told the assembly what he had seen. He spoke not with anger, but with a simple, unimpeachable dignity. When he finished, the silence was one of deep, collective shame. Then Dr. Ames spoke, her voice clear and precise. She explained the medical evidence of the staged raid, and she vouched for Maeve's character and the truth of the flyers. Finally, Maeve was asked to speak. She stood before the crowd, Pike's ledger and Finn's book in her hands. She did not raise her voice. She simply told her story. From the first overheard conversation to the final confrontation at the bridge. She looked at the faces before her, the same faces that had jeered at her. And she no longer saw a mob. She saw individuals, men and women who had been misled by fear and prejudice, and who were now, for the first time, seeing clearly. When she finished, the blacksmith stood up, his great soot-stained hands twisting the brim of his hat. "We were wrong," he said, his voice a low rumble. "We were wrong to listen to the hate. We were wrong to blame the Lakota. We were wrong to treat this woman with such disrespect." He looked directly at Maeve. "On behalf of the decent people of this town, I ask for your forgiveness." A murmur of assent ran through the room. The poison had been drawn. That afternoon, a temporary judgment was rendered, not by a man in a black robe, but by the consensus of the community. They drafted a formal petition to the territorial government, supported by the ledgers and the testimony, demanding the immediate prosecution of Pike and Harlan. More importantly, they passed a local ordinance, handwritten by Miller and signed by every man present. It guaranteed the right of safe passage and trade for the Lakota people through the Ash Hollow Valley. It explicitly forbade any form of incitement or hateful speech against them. The next day, Maeve saw a group of men, including the blacksmith, down by the creek that marked the old trading boundary. They were pulling up the old, weathered posts. They were replacing them with new ones, and they were painting them not a color of warning, but a bright, welcoming blue. The old lines were not being redrawn, they were being remade into a bridge. A few days later, a small delegation approached Maeve as she sat on the porch of the boarding house. It was the blacksmith, Nora Quinn, and the owner of the mercantile. They told her that the man who had owned the small, defunct newspaper had packed up and left town in the night. But the press, the sleeping giant, was still there. "This town needs a voice," the blacksmith said. "A true one. We need someone to make sure we do not forget this lesson. We want you to be the editor of the Ash Hollow Sentinel." Maeve was stunned into silence. Her, the outcast, the plain-faced seamstress, the woman they had called ugly, to be the public voice of the town that had scorned her. It was a reversal so profound she could not quite grasp it. She looked at their earnest faces and saw that they were serious. A new life was being offered to her, a life of purpose and respect she had never dared to dream of. "I will do it," she said, her voice quiet but firm. "On one condition. Every week, the paper will have a column. It will be called The Valley Speaks. It will be a place for the voices of the railroad workers, the prospectors, and the Lakota people, their stories, their concerns, told in their own words. This paper will not belong to one person or one interest. It will belong to everyone." They agreed without hesitation. That evening, as the setting sun painted the sky in soft, healing colors, she sat with Chaska on the same porch. His arm was in a sling, but the color had returned to his face, and his eyes were clear and calm. They watched the town settle into a peaceful twilight, the first truly peaceful night Maeve had known there. "So you are to be a woman of words," he said, a faint smile touching his lips. "It seems so," she replied. She was quiet for a long moment, watching the first stars appear. "What will you do now?" "I will go back to my people," he said, "but I will also return here. The new boundary posts must be honored. Trust must be built, like a strong house, one log at a time. It will take time. And us?" The question was a whisper, a breath of vulnerability in the cool air. "What of us?" He turned to look at her, his gaze so direct and seeing that it still made her heart catch. "What do you wish for?" "I do not want to belong to anyone," she said, the words coming from the deepest part of her, from the core of her long fight for a place in the world. "I have spent my whole life being owned by the opinions of others, by my lack of fortune, by my own fear. I will not trade one cage for another, no matter how beautiful it may be." He did not seem offended. He seemed to understand perfectly. He reached out with his good hand and gently took hers. His touch was warm and steady. "The eagle does not own the sky it flies in," he said, his voice low and soft. "It is its partner. They move together. My people believe a man and a woman walk a path side by side, not one behind the other. We are together not because I own you, or you own me. We are together because we choose each other each dawn." She looked into his eyes, and she saw the truth of his words reflected there. He did not want to possess her. He wanted to stand with her. The choice was not a single, binding promise made in a moment of passion. It was 1,000 small choices, to be made every day. It was a freedom more profound than any she had ever imagined. She leaned her head against his good shoulder, the rough buckskin soft against her cheek. The wind that blew through Ash Hollow no longer felt like a hostile force. It was just the breath of the land, a land that was finally beginning to know her name. The raw, high plains wind of autumn no longer felt like an enemy. It had a different voice now, a dry, rustling whisper that spoke of cured grasses and the coming promise of a hard, honest winter. It swept through an ash hollow that was slowly, painstakingly, learning to be a different kind of town. The change was not in the buildings, which were still raw lumber and false fronts, but in the spaces between them, in the way people looked at each other, their gazes a little steadier, a little more thoughtful. The scar from Pike's reign of fear was still there, but it was healing, knitting the community together in a way that prosperity never could. Several months had passed, the season had turned, and with it, the fortunes of many. On the wide, sun-warmed porch of the Quinn's boarding house, a new and unlikely school had taken root. Each afternoon, Maeve gathered her students. They were a motley collection, the shy, freckle-faced children of the railroad Gandhi dancers, their hands still calloused from chores. And, to the astonishment of many, a handful of Lakota teenagers, including Anpatu, they would ride in from the valley, their ponies left to graze with the town's horses, and take their places on the wooden benches, their initial stiff formalities slowly melting into a quiet curiosity. Maeve was not a trained teacher, but she had a patient heart and a clear hand. She taught them their letters using charcoal on a wide, smooth plank of pine. She taught them to form words, to read the simple headlines from the newspapers she now so carefully crafted. They read of crop prices and weather reports, of a new blacksmith's apprentice and the birth of a child. There were no more stories of raids, no more whispers of savages. The words they learned were the words of a community, of neighbors. At first, the two groups of children had sat apart, separated by a chasm of history and suspicion. But the shared struggle of forming a difficult letter, the quiet triumph of reading a word aloud for the first time, these small things became a bridge. Soon, a railroad boy was showing Anpatu how to write her name in the flowing script Maeve taught, and she, in turn, was showing him the Lakota symbol for horse, drawing it in the dust with a stick. Maeve watched them, and saw in their tentative interactions the fragile, hopeful blueprint for a different kind of future. Chaska did not live in Ash Hollow. His spirit was too deeply tied to the open land, to the rhythms of the seasons and the life of his own people. But he was no stranger. He had become a sought-after guide, a man whose word was his bond, whose knowledge of the land was unparalleled. Freight companies and survey crews now hired him, paying him a fair wage to guide them safely through the territory. It was a role that suited him, allowing him to be a bridge himself, a man who walked in two worlds and belonged fully to both. He ensured the new agreements were honored, that trade was fair, that misunderstandings were resolved with words before they could fester into conflict. His path often brought him back to Ash Hollow, sometimes for a night, sometimes for a week. He would spend time with Mazaska's people in the valley, and he would spend time with Maeve. Their relationship had settled into a rhythm as natural and unforced as the changing seasons. There were no grand declarations, no binding promises. There was only the quiet joy of his return, the comfortable silence as they sat on the porch in the evenings, the easy way his hand would find hers. It was a partnership, a daily choosing, and for Maeve, it was a deeper and more profound love than any she had ever read about in the sentimental novels that sometimes made their way west. One morning, she stood on the porch alone, the crisp autumn air cool on her cheeks. The sun was just rising, flooding the valley with a clean, golden light. In her hands, she held the latest edition of the Ash Hollow Sentinel, the ink still faintly damp. The press, her sleeping giant, was now fully awake, its voice her own. She had spent the night setting the type, her fingers stained with the ink of her new trade. The headline was not about a crime or a conflict. It read, "A Bridge of Hands." The story beneath it was about the old wooden trestle, the scene of their final, desperate confrontation. A summer flash flood had weakened its foundations, and the railroad had declared it unsafe. A new one was being built, but this time, the railroad crew was not working alone. Several men from the town, including the blacksmith, had volunteered their labor, and, in a gesture that would have been unthinkable a season ago, a few of the younger Lakota men had come to help as well, their skill with an axe and their knowledge of the land's contours proving invaluable. The story was about more than timbers and iron spikes. It was about the slow, difficult work of rebuilding trust. She heard the soft tread of moccasins on the wooden steps and turned. Chaska was standing there, his travel-stained buckskins telling of a long journey. He had returned. He did not speak, but a slow smile touched his lips, a smile that reached his dark, quiet eyes. He moved to stand beside her, so close that their arms brushed. A current, a familiar warmth, passed between them. He looked down at the paper in her hands, at the headline, and nodded, a silent acknowledgement of the world they were both helping to build. In that moment, in the clear, honest light of the new day, the memory came to her, not as a painful specter, but as a quiet, distant echo. She remembered the hidden canyon, the taste of fear and despair, the feeling of a lifetime of shame cresting inside her like a bitter tide. She remembered her own broken whisper, the confession of a woman who felt herself to be unseen, unvalued. For a moment, she tried to summon the old voices, the cruel barbs from the saloon, the casual dismissals she had endured in a dozen other towns. She listened for the word ugly, for the sneer of plain, but they were gone. They had no power here, no purchase in her soul. They were nothing more than the meaningless chatter of ghosts. The only voice she heard, the only memory that rang with the clarity of truth, was his. It was as real and solid as the man standing beside her. "I see the woman you are." She looked up at him, at his strong, quiet face, and her heart was so full she thought it might burst. He had not given her a new face. He had given her back her own. He had seen past the world's judgment to the person beneath, and in his seeing, he had set her free. The greatest freedom, she now knew, was not a place on a map, but a place in another's heart. A place where you were seen, truly and completely, for who you were. And love, in this wild and unforgiving land, was not a prize to be won, but a choice to be made, each and every dawn, to stand together and face the rising sun. Thank you for joining us on this journey through the heart of the Old West. We would love for you to comment where you are listening from so we can all connect and share our thoughts. And please subscribe to my channel, Wild West Tales. Like the video. And support us further by pressing the hype button so this story can be heard by more people.